With the release of Spider-Man Far From Home, the final film in Phase 3 of the MCU has hit theaters. That means today we're going to stop and rank all three phases of the MCU from the worst to the best. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Chandler, and I started this channel because I was driving everyone around me crazy talking about movies way too much. If you can relate, you're probably in the right place. Consider clicking that subscribe button. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share your ranking of all three phases of the MCU. Obviously, you clicked on the video because we all love these movies, so let's keep it nice and friendly. Also, you might not know that I'm very active over on Instagram. I usually post more than one image per day. I'm posting stories all day long, and the DMs over there are probably the best way to get a hold of me. With that said, let's get started. In third place is Phase 1. What makes Phase 1 so interesting is that it's bookended by two fantastic MCU films. At the beginning end, you got Iron Man, which is a great standalone comic book movie that doesn't have the weight of the whole MCU on its shoulders. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Avengers, which was the first time all of these characters came together and set the template for everything that was to come. Even Joss Whedon kind of created this kind of quip a second tone that kind of continued throughout the rest of these movies. But everything between those two ones is kind of all over the place. The second film in Phase 2 was The Incredible Hulk, which tonally doesn't fit with anything else inside of the MCU. There's very few jokes inside of the film. The color scheme seems a little bit different. Obviously, Edward Norton didn't return. Thunderbolt Ross is really only our character in this film that makes appearances later on. Plot points are just kind of abandoned. So it feels like this oddity inside of the MCU. And even sometimes in the comment section, people tell me, oh, The Incredible Hulk's not part of the MCU. Yeah, it is. It just feels very different. Then you have Iron Man 2, where they were trying to figure out how do you stick to a schedule? How do you build a universe while telling a standalone story that works inside of itself? And this one didn't work so well inside of itself because they were trying so hard to set so many things up and make the movie by a specific release date. Jon Favreau wanted 3 years. They only gave him 2 years. And I think it shows in the script that he ended up with. And so that was them figuring out how to build this big world while telling individual stories. And then you move on to Thor, and you can tell that there's some magic in the cast here, that they kind of have an idea that this is some great actors that could do something great, but they hadn't fully figured out how to do that yet. You see Chris Hemsworth in that film, and he is certainly not as kind of confident in the role and hasn't figured out how to have the bravado of Thor, the heroism of Thor, as well as the comedy of Thor quite right yet. And so it's kind of feels a little bit different. Same thing, low-key feels very low-key inside of this film as compared to what the character starts to feel like in the later films, as they were still figuring out what they were doing. And then Captain America: The First Avenger, I think, is a film that was limited by the fact that they were trying to get to the beginning of the Avengers, and so therefore they had a movie that had to end with him going through all his origin story, all of World War II, and then ending up at a point in time where he would end up in the Avengers. And so because of this, you have a phase that's largely trying to figure out how to do everything. How do all these characters work? How do you have a cosmic realm as well as World War II, as well as the present time? How do you have magic with technology? And that's what this phase was all about. Now, while I've been kind of negative on the fact that they were figuring it out, there's a lot of entertainment value in seeing all of this come together, in seeing what this world looked like, and exploring all of these places for the first time, whether you're going to Asgard, or just the fun of Tony Stark developing all of his technology. It works really nicely. And that it is the beginning of the MCU. They are tied together, and so you have little hints, post-credit scenes where they find Thor's hammer leading into the Thor. But what it doesn't have is every movie so intertwined that you have to see everything else to understand what's going on. These movies work in and of themselves, but they tease the other movies. And so in a certain way, they make them a little bit easier to watch on their own. They're easier to digest because it's not so intertwined at this point in time. So inside of Phase 1, my favorite film here is The Avengers, and the runner-up would be Iron Man. Both of those are in the top 5 for me. I really enjoy both of those films. The worst film in Phase 1 for me is Iron Man 2. It's my second least favorite film inside of the MCU, though it still has its moments inside of it that do work. The average Rotten Tomatoes score of these 6 films is an 80.5. That is the lowest average of any of the phases, but only by about that much. And then yesterday I put out a poll and I asked you guys, which is your favorite phase in the MCU? And only 3% of you said that Phase 1 was your favorite. So based off my selection, based off Rotten Tomatoes, and based off the poll, Phase 1 comes in last. Our runner-up is Phase 2, and whereas Phase 1's bookends were the best aspect of that phase, interesting enough, in Phase 2, the two movies in the middle are pretty widely regarded as the best of the phase, with Winter Soldier and Guardians of the Galaxy. The phase starts off with Iron Man 3 and Thor 2, which, generally speaking, aren't some of the more loved MCU films, and then it ends with Age of Ultron and Ant-Man, and Age of Ultron, generally speaking, most people are a little disappointed by it. Ant-Man, by the very nature of it, isn't intended to be kind of a home run film. For me, the best thing about Phase 2 is also the worst thing about Phase 2. They went bigger, bolder, and took more risks. And some of those risks absolutely paid off, like with Guardians of the Galaxy, and some of those risks didn't work so well, and there's some fumbles inside of it. If you just kind of walk through the phase, Iron Man 3 tried to subvert some expectations and throw a bunch of plot lines in there, and for the most part, it frustrated a whole lot of viewers, especially with what they did with the Mandarin, which was certainly a big, bold risk, but probably not something that made a lot of people happy. Also, the movie ends with Iron Man blowing up all of his suits, which was a plot line that basically got abandoned, and they had to retcon it later on in Captain America Civil War as to why he didn't stop being Iron Man after that film. And then you move on to Thor 2, and it's a movie that throws so many kind of plot lines out there. We start looking for the ether, one of our Infinity Stones, so it's sort of progressing the plot line, but they weren't quite sure still what to do with the Thor character. And then you do Captain America the Winter Soldier, where they literally burn S.H.I.E.L.D. to the ground, turn the whole universe upside down, which is a massive, big, bold risk that totally paid off. Then they do their weirdest project yet in Guardians of the Galaxy with talking trees and talking raccoons, and we're off in space with a human from the 80s, and they get James Gunn, a kind of a very quirky, odd director with a history with trauma, to direct it, and they make one of the most personal, heartfelt films inside of this universe that's a personal favorite of mine. Then you move into Age of Ultron, where they just went bigger and bigger and bigger with everything. And I think for the most part, the results weren't quite as good, even though they went for more of everything. And then they closed out with Ant-Man, a film that was intentionally smaller and I think works for what it's going for, but it introduces a bunch of weird new technology into the mix, and in its own way is taking its own risks. In a lot of ways, this is the bridge phase between the origins of Phase 1 and the master plan of Phase 3. Here they lay kind of that groundwork for the bridge to get to the big, massive payoff inside of Phase 3. As for me, the worst movie in this phase is the worst movie in the entire MCU. That is Thor: The Dark World. It's a movie that I just don't think works very well on any level. It is professionally made. It's not particularly good. And then the best two would be Guardians of the Galaxy and Captain America Winter Soldier, which are two vastly different films, but both work on their own terms. When it comes to Rotten Tomatoes, we said Phase 1 was 80.5. Phase 2's average score is 80.67, so only beat it out by about that much. Then back over on my poll, once again, only 3% of you said Phase 2 was the best phase inside of the MCU. So based off Rotten Tomatoes, just by a hair, Phase 2 beats out Phase 1. Based off a poll, they're tied. And as for my personal preference, I think Phase 2 is just a little bit better than Phase 1 on an overall quality level. But coming in first place by quite a bit is Phase 3. After all the successes of Phases 1 and 2, they had the confidence to make a long-term plan that would intertwine through over 10 films, all working towards their endgame. By this point in time, they'd figured out how to take even the weirdest of properties and design them in a way that would appeal to a mass audience, as well as take their kind of bag of entertainment tricks, sprinkle it across the whole thing, so no matter what the film was, it would entertain audiences. At the same time, I would probably also say that these are the two biggest faults of Phase 3, as that certainly at times you can feel that MCU template, especially like with Doctor Strange, you feel them squishing his origin story through that MCU origin movie template. And likewise with a lot of these movies, probably half of these movies, I think that the humor at times undercuts the drama. That's in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Doctor Strange, I think the humor just feels a little bit forced in that film. Thor Ragnarok puts humor over drama. Endgame, I think, undercuts some of the emotional effects of Thor Bowski by going so far into comedy. And even Spider-Man Far From Home, which is a comedy, I think at times they went too far with what they were going for. Of course, with all the problems that you could have with a set of movies, that they're too funny and they're trying too hard to make them appeal to a broad audience is probably not the worst problems that movies can have, because all of these movies put a smile on my face. Even Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, with all my issues with it, I laugh out loud at certain points in time inside of that film. But what makes Phase 3 so special is that master plan that I talked about before, that they were following up so many films before, that we had built such a world and developed these characters so much that you could do things inside of Phase 3 that you can't really do inside of other franchises because there's not enough backstory to be able to tell certain types of stories. When you talk about Captain America Civil War, that story only works because we spent so much time with both Tony as well as Steve in all these previous films, understanding their worldview, their value sets, the mistakes that they've made, the people that they're friends with. That's why that movie can have the tension that it does, that you can feel the betrayal, that you can understand why Steve would do the things he would do in that film, as well as why Tony would feel he needs to support big government intervention. And then, of course, the ultimate example of this would be Infinity War and Endgame, which were the culmination of over 10 years of filmmaking, story, planting little seeds and storylines that I feel like they absolutely landed the ship, led us to a satisfying conclusion that was emotional, that was exciting, that it was heroic. It's the best stuff that you can do with superhero movies. To use a baseball analogy, phases 1 and 2 loaded up the bases, and then phase 3 was able to knock it out of the park, hit that home run, get the grand slam. And so the only reason phase 3 is so good is because phases 1 and 2 were also so good to lay all the groundwork. But also in phase 3, all kind of these standalone movies thrown into the mix are also really good. Of course, Black Panther's nominated for Best Picture. I think some of the visual effects in Doctor Strange are absolutely fantastic. The novelty of going back to the 90s and seeing a de-aged Nick Fury was a ton of fun for me. So this is a phase that really is peak MCU. It's great entertainment with a master plan that all kind of comes together. So I absolutely love it. That's why it's my personal number 1. Rotten Tomatoes average score for this one is an 89.18. On my poll that I put out there, I put a 4th category in there for DCEU movies, and that got 5%, beating out phase 1 and 2. But at number 1 easily was phase 3, with 88% agreeing with me that this is the best phase of the MCU. Now, of course, those of you that can do math will realize that those numbers don't add up to 100%. Apparently, YouTube doesn't know how to do math. I think phase 3 is number 1. Rotten Tomatoes has phase 3 as number 1, and you guys picked phase 3 as number 1. So easily, without question, the dominant winner is phase 3 at number 1. If you've enjoyed this video and want more Marvel content from me, check out that playlist right over there for all of my MCU rankings, the movies, the heroes, the villains, all of that fun stuff. Also remember to check me out at Instagram at that link down below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.